So I created a really basic terrain before, and you can load in the current scene, which is procedural terrain design, and that is included with the training. If you want to start out from where I'm at, what we created in the previous section, I'm going to go ahead and save this as terrain design or procedural terrain design 01, and that way we have a separate scene with this preserved. And what I want to show you now is how we can move beyond this simple setup, which is really just two nodes, into something a little more complex. Because right now we just have the turbulence modifying the variable roughness. So what we can do is modify, and what I want to do is add a little bit more details, some more features, and what we can do is combine different fractals together. And we can also add filters to modify the output. I'll just show you a quick filter really quick. I'm going to right click, go to filter, and there's a whole bunch of them in here for different things. Let's take a look at the parabolic. And what I'm going to do is connect that to the altitude, and then the altitude to the output of the parabolic. And we can see how we can modify using A, B, and C values and get a different look for the terrain. Right now the gain is really high. Which is why we're getting all these really sharp points here. But that's the easy way just to add something to the numeric. And so I'm just going to go ahead and delete that right now. And let's take a look at mixing it with another fractal node. So I go back, refresh. And now we can see that back to where it was. And what I want to do now is add in another fractal. And let's use the terrain fractal version 2. What I'm also going to do is connect that and change it to use that multiply input. And then it's still using the seed. And then I'm just going to reconnect so we can take a look at just the terrain fractal by itself. And then we can modify largest feature, metascale, and I might just bring that down just so we have something a little more obvious. I'm going to increase the bump surge. It doesn't look like that's doing much right now. Let's do buoyancy, a little bit of gain. We'll bring that metascale back. And there we have a new terrain there. And what we can do is now mix them. And there's a couple of different ways to mix them. The primary way you'll find in mixing is the combiner node. We have blender and combiner. We could also just simply add or subtract. And then there's a couple options for when you're editing materials, and we have color combiners and things like that. If we go to just the blender, this is a pretty straightforward node where what you do is you have two inputs, input 0 and input 1. Actually, we'll go ahead and use our original variable roughness, altitude for input 0, and the altitude of the terrain fractal, the new one, on input 1. And then we can connect that to the output here. So now this is a basic blend. We'll start out, if we're at 0, we have input 0, which is the variable roughness, go all the way to 1, and then we have that terrain fractal. So we can go in between and mix those two together that way. We could also choose from the different combination modes. We can choose whether or not we're adding one to the other. So it's going to add that additional detail. We can do maximum amounts from each one. There's a minimum. Take the lower values of each one. We could also subtract from it. which is pretty cool looking. I like what's showing up here. Looks neat. And then we could also just multiply them, which you want to be careful with the multiply options if you have too high of a gain on some things, because that can create some very sharp peaks in a lot of cases. So that's just a simple mix right there. This ratio amount can also be controlled using any other numeric input. So we don't just have to use just a number, which we have here between 0 and 1, to mix them. We can have it variable based on a fractal or noise. So if I go ahead and left click on it, I'm going to go to connect parameter. Now this constant number is this separate node, and what we can do is replace that with a noise or a fractal. If I just use a noise, we just have something very basic. We do want to make sure that our output amount from this is going to be 0 to 1. I'm going to go ahead to the blender and I'm going to change it to the blend mode. So we're either going to get one or the other, and it's not going to be a total mix. And actually, I'll go ahead and change that over to a fractal and not a noise node because we have less control. So we'll go to simple fractal. And if we want to just take a look at that fractal itself, we can tie that into the altitude. And we can see, because the gain on the other nodes is so high, it's actually making it a little difficult to see. Let's go ahead and use the terrain Perlin noise. I can increase the gain, that way we can see it better. Decrease roughness a little. And what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that this is giving us an output between 0 and 1. So what I want to use is the function node preview, which we have right here. And we can see, actually our output is a little high. Let's go back to the gain of 10, and we can see, I'm going to go ahead and scale that up. So we can see all that. And automatic extension is turned on, so it'll give us the highest amount that it has right now, which is 2.4. So what I'm going to do is create a filter node and set it to map. And now our highest point upper is 2.4, and it might be our lowest point as well, 2.4. And then I'm going to set the output range to 0 to 1. So let's take a look and see. We might need to lower that range, the negative range, just a little, maybe -1. And we can just take a look and see the output where 0 is and where 1 is, because we don't want anything beyond that, because our ratio control is only 0 to 1. I mean, we can go beyond, but then it's going to push beyond the mix that we have set up. So now it's mixing based on this simple fractal, which we can change the scale of, and we can see down here what that looks like. So it's an easy way to kind of mix together different fractals or noises. And when we get one or the other, what we can also do is go into the blender and we can choose to clip the ratios beyond 0 and 1. So that way it only gives us a value between 0 and 1, and everything beyond that is going to be clipped. So now we have a little bit of a mix between both of them. So we also have other combiner nodes. If we go to combiner and add just the standard combiner, we can see it only gives us one input to begin with, but as we start adding inputs, it will open up new ones. So let's go ahead and connect that to the altitude. Now you can see input 2 is available. So this allows you to connect to multiple nodes all at once, and then you can choose the amplitude and then also offset the overall value. And the offset, essentially, if we have a value between -1 and 1, and we offset it by 1, then we'll have a value between 0 and 2. So it just raises or lowers that, and that's really useful for when you're using like the multiply option. So there's a bunch of different options we have in here for the combination mode. And then I'm going to just connect that to the output, and then we can choose the amplitude for each one, whether it be negative or positive. You can see that's really strong now and giving us a very large output. And then we could adjust the amplitude of the other node. And then if we want, we could also mix in that simple fractal that we had for the combiner or the blender. We could add to it, or we could set multiply, and then we could just start multiplying all these together to get something interesting. And it looks like it's going out a little too far. So in this case, what we could do is, since we can see we have an extension of 48.9, we could go back and use that map node again. If we go to filter and map, add that to the output, set our high value to 50. Let's see our low value, let's say negative 10 should be good, and then we'll do negative 1 to 1. And that should give us a slightly better output. And it looks like maybe we didn't need to do negative 10. Maybe we'll go down a little further to level it out. And we could reduce that to increase the gain on it a little bit. Or we could set the upper value on the output to raise it up as well. And I'm going to keep it like this, so I'm going to go ahead and delete the unused nodes. And we could also double click on these to collapse them, make them a little smaller, organize things a little if needed, so that way it doesn't get too jumbled. Because otherwise it can get really confusing if you have way too much going on. And there we have a mixed fractal terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and then this will be saved as Procedural Terrain Design 01. And here's a final render quality of that terrain. And one thing I want to show you is right now we have everything being cut off at the back of those features there, and where the high points are in the back. And what we want to do, or what I'd like to do, is add on to that, but I don't want to create another terrain and fill it in. So what we can do is, now this is if you're using object parametric. If you're using a world mapping mode, all you have to do is just increase the terrain scale, and it'll automatically fill in those areas. But in this case, what I want to do is extend, if we go ahead and take a look at the preview of the scene, which we can click on up here, and then we can see where the camera's at, and you can see how the mountains in the back are being cut off. So I don't want that showing up, and I do want to extend that a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and extend the terrain canvas, which is up here. This will allow us to increase the size. Go 2 kilometers, and then you can also set which direction you want to go in. I'm just going to set it in the center and have it go all the way around. And it's going to ask if I want to create a new zone. I'm going to just click yes. And that's the former terrain zone, and this is the new entire terrain zone. So we have the terrain that we had before, and now it also extended to make it 2 kilometers. So that now we're getting all of that extra geometry in back. And if we take a look at the function and see what it did, we have to kind of move these out of the way so we can see the order of them. But what it did was it took and created an offset node, but mainly it just changed the scale, which is using the XYZ product. You can do this manually too, although this way makes it easier to maintain the same altitude. So it's essentially just changing it by 2 because we're going from 1 kilometer to 2 kilometers. So it's compressing more into the terrain area. So now we'll have more geometry in the back just beyond those mountains. And if you're in world mode or object mode, like I said, you can just increase the scale, and that'll automatically fill it in. You won't need to use the extend canvas. So if we go back into the terrain editor, we also now basically have kind of like a terrain preset we could load in for this design and style of terrain. But if this isn't the exact shape we're looking for, not the right features, what we can do is just randomize it, and then we can move around the vector to get something closer to what we're looking for. So we can use that existing fractal and just move around within it. You could go in and change the vector manually too. But this way it gives us some nice random numbers in order to generate different terrains. What we could also do is just set the scale a little higher if we wanted, or a little lower. Setting it to 2 brings us back to the scale we were at before when we had it set to 1 kilometer. We can go back to 0.5, and that would be like extending the scale to 0.4 kilometers, but the vertical gain is then different. So it changes the height, as we can see here, which is why it's easier just to use the extend terrain canvas, so that way you don't have to worry about matching up all the elevation levels. We're now going to take a quick look at the stratification filters, and I'm just using the procedural terrain design file that was created earlier, just to show really quick. 2 different stratify options, and what I'm going to do when I'm in the function, so if you're not in the function editor, right click on the altitude production, hit edit function to open it up, and this is going to be a filter. So we're going to go right click, go to filter, and we're going to go to recursive. So we have a strata and confined strata. Now these are numeric controls. Confined strata is the same as regular strata, except it only goes within certain altitude ranges. And then there's this 3D stratification, but that is for manipulating a vector. So first what I'm going to do is just select the strata filter, and we're going to connect it to the altitude and put that in the chain, and now we should start to see stratified layers showing up already. I'm going to go ahead and just double the resolution. We can see it a little better. A couple of different options. We can make the layers a little harder. It's going to flatten them out on top. If we need to, we can use plateau filling to kind of fill in those areas with a little more detail, so that they're not completely flat, unless that's what you're looking for. But you can see these areas that are kind of raising up and the flat areas, that's because of the plateau filling. So we can add a little more detail to those if we don't want them to be completely smooth. We can smooth out the edges of the strata layer, and then we can increase the thickness. Which really smooths it out if you go up too high, and no amount of plateau filling is going to make up for that if you go too high. Then the layer spacing, so we can have bigger layers in between. And then we can also adjust the angle and heading of the strata. So if we want to tilt it a bit, and now if we go and move on, change this to 3D, or sorry, not 3D, just the confined strata. It's, like I was saying, the same as the other strata, except what we have is the ability to adjust the altitude. So if we take a look at the function node preview, we take a look at the amounts, you can see that our output value is 5.72. So that is, in this case, the highest point. It doesn't look like it goes that far down. It might on some of the axes. I'm going to go ahead and change the scale to 1 so we just see the terrain and not anything beyond it. So what I can do, and now this only goes up to 1 because typically we work between -1 and 1. But since we're going beyond that, we do need to manually type in the value. So I'm going to type in a value of 3, so it's going to go up to wherever 3 is on here, and it is only going to stratify up to the value of 3, which is the controlled altitude. So we can see it stopping when it gets a little higher. We can also set the lower value, or if I just, let's say, set this to 2, we can just have one thin strip that goes across. Just right here. So that's between 3 and 2. So if you just want one bar kind of sticking out. Basically same features as the other stratification filter, except this one has altitude constraints, which can be pretty nice. And then if you want, you could go ahead and set that back down to 0 or so we can move the stratified layers down. And then if you want, you can also decrease the processing strength a little bit so we don't have such hard edges. And I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And we should have a little bit of a strata showing up there. And if the output is a little too jagged, which is usually happens with the default values for the quality of the procedural terrain, when you're using the strata filter, I highly recommend increasing the quality boost, and that way you don't have those weird triangles showing up, and you can get a much better render. It will, of course, take a little bit longer and increase the polygon resolution.